My name is Malcolm Sim. Working the boats when I was young, I got all over the world and to a lot of places that I didn't know the history of, the folklore of, whatever. It only really cost me once, one time. I was shipping salt for CFT lines. We were docked in Varna on the Black Sea. There was trouble. I'd gotten in with a few guys who were smuggling pain pills all up and down the coast, and one of them talked. I woke up one afternoon on the boat, and suddenly it felt like I had maybe an hour to jump ship and get the hell out of there. I was terrified. I was 22. So I ran for it. I gathered up my stuff, I went right to the train station, and I pointed to a map on the wall just someplace west, into the middle of nowhere. And the woman sold me a ticket. I was on that train for 6-8 hours. I didn't expect it to get so hilly. And then the train was in the mountains. And we stopped at some remote station, a hut, basically, for what felt like forever, and someone told me the police were coming aboard to do a routine check of something or other. And I freaked out, and I snuck off. I started walking down a dirt road in the dark at like 2 a.m. Had no idea where I was going. After about an hour, when it was obvious I wasn't going to come across a town or anything, I stopped. I thought I'd wait a little longer, then head back toward the station where I knew at least I wouldn't be open prey to bears or whatever. A lot of people would say the area I was in was beautiful, I guess, but I didn't see it. Hills upon hills, deep forest, unpopulated. Maybe 1 or 2 little old stone houses tucked away along the road, which was dirt sometimes and sometimes pavement with no lines or markings. It was probably put down once 50 years before and never repaired, lots of cracks and holes in it. No cars went by, not one. I left the road and sat at the edge of a huge field, under the stars, wondering what to do. Everything I owned in the world was in my backpack, all 10 pounds of it. It was getting cold, birds were making sounds like I'd never heard before in the trees. And here it came, the sound I was most scared of. Dogs howling somewhere, probably a whole pack. God knows what kind or how hungry to kill something they were. Wolves. It started with just one, kind of warbling, singing. And then others joined in. It sounded like flutes almost, that would start and stop and rise and fall. A haunted kind of sound that just stopped suddenly. I saw a glittering light far away in the woods, so I walked in that direction across these dark fields. And in a while, I could see a house. But this one was big. It was tough to reach. The trees got thick, and I lost the light sometimes, and I had to climb a brutal hill and down the other side. There it was. Pretty much a mansion. Lots of brick and solid rock, with lights on in some of the windows. There wasn't any fence or gate on the back side. I just came out of the forest, and I was on the grounds. It was tough to see anything in the dark, but the lawn felt really overgrown. The grass was brushing my ankles. Something that looked like long, heavy bags of dirt or mulch were spread around here and there. I felt safe. I walked right up to the place, across a bumpy brick patio. I think I meant to knock on the big back door, but it was open, wide open. Warm light inside, so I walked right in. It was a damned nice place, I'll tell you that. I went down this hallway and I turned a corner and I was in a huge open room, big as a ballroom. Antique furniture and a massive, complicated carpet and a chandelier, and everything was red and brown and oak and gold. Art on the walls, a pool table in one corner. It was made for a band to play in and the people to dance in gowns and tuxedos. But instead, there were dead people in it. There were dead people in it, lying on the carpet. I think 7 or 8 of them, lying there, on their sides, on their stomachs, face up, face down. Men, women, no gowns or tuxedos, just t-shirts and jeans. I would have run, but at first I couldn't be sure what I was seeing. I wanted to be sure. It was confusing because there was something about their skin that wasn't right. I had to get close to a few of the bodies for it to sink in. Most of them, it looked like somebody had crawled inside their skin and then painted them with light blue streaks from underneath it. Wide blue streaks with a brush. I'd never seen that before, and I thought, is this real? One guy, half his face was like that. One of his eyes was bulging out. And I heard a voice behind me. It's the exohemperin. That's what this guy behind me said, in the kind of accent I'd heard in ports on the Black Sea and on the train. I turned, and there he was, standing on the curving steps that led up to a balcony. He was coming down, step by step, real slow. He was my age, and as skinny as me, but with a huge beard and a ponytail, wearing sweats, wrinkled gray sweats. The exohemperin caused that blue look, he said. He looked at the bodies like he was a medical student, just kind of interested in the effect for a paper he had to write. Even at 22, I'd already learned, you don't show fear when you're in a situation you don't understand. You turn on your aggression. No matter how scared you are, that's how you survive things. I told him he should maybe think about not taking one more step down that staircase until he told me what had happened here. But it was like he didn't care. He couldn't take his eyes off the body, so he kept coming. He came all the way down. He told me he'd hidden through the whole thing. He'd been hiding under his bed like a little kid and stayed there for hours. But he'd suspected what they'd done. They'd come looking for him, but they never found him. That one over there, he said, and he pointed to the body that was closest to my feet. Some guy in his 60s, maybe, eyes closed, peaceful, chin up like he was soaking in the rays of the chandelier. His lips and his forehead were blue. That's Dr. Penny. This was the guy to finally convince them all to do it. It had been suicide, every one of them. The ones here and the ones on the back lawn. The ones I'd thought, in the dark, were bags of mulch, maybe. I said, why? My host, which is how I think of him now, he collapsed into a big wicker chair and he scrunched his hands real tight on the arms. He looked so tired he could barely keep his head up. He said things had been strange here in the mansion for months. What with Dr. Penny filling their heads with all kinds of weird philosophies. Drugs, too. There'd been a lot of drugs. And then, one day, they'd captured the prisoner. After that, a couple of the people, my host told me their names, but I've forgotten them, started to really lose their minds. There was fighting over what they should do with the prisoner, but it didn't really matter. Even Dr. Penny, who'd worked for 10 years to catch one, couldn't deal with how black the sight of the prisoner made his mind. He'd started talking about what it meant in his belief system, and it wasn't pretty. That night, sometime around 8 o'clock, my host had heard everyone coming out of the rooms, and he just knew the end was here. He hid. He saw people come into his room, saw their feet from under the bed, but no one had looked under it. They all went downstairs. He'd heard Dr. Penny telling them all something. There was music. Someone played an LP by some old Ukrainian pop star, and I remember seeing that ridiculous record jacket beside the turntable in that room. That music, that record, was the last sound my host had ever heard from any of them. Then I came along. I asked about this prisoner, who the prisoner was. "Would you like to see him?" my host asked me. And I think I said, "What I'd like is for you to maybe keep sitting right there in your chair and not move because I'm leaving." He stroked his big beard and smiled and said I'd be doing him a favor if I at least looked, because he didn't know himself sometimes if the prisoner was real or a delusion. Dr. Penny had drubbed all the local legends into them about the things that supposedly lived in these mountains. But it was still impossible to truly believe. He raised an arm and pointed to an oversized door in the corner of the room. He said it was right through there. That's all I needed to do was go through the door. I went that way. I tried not to look at the bodies again. I tried to keep an eye on my weird host as I went, but he didn't seem to have the slightest interest in approaching me. Through the door, there was darkness. Only if I kept the door open was there enough light to see by. The room was just as big as the one I just left, bigger even. But there was absolutely nothing in there. Just a vast cement floor in every direction, like I'd stepped into an empty factory or a slaughterhouse or something. An echo every time I moved. And up ahead, a big raised square. It looked like when you cover a pool with tarp stretched real tight. I moved deeper in. Then there was a sudden snapping sound and I froze. I heard chains moving, gears turning. I turned around and I saw my host's silhouette standing in the doorway. He'd reached an arm into the room and activated some mechanism on the wall that I couldn't see. Whatever was covering the mammoth square ahead of me was retracting. It was a rusty, clanging sound, like the mechanism was old or not cared for very well. It went on for about 10 seconds, and then it was quiet again. A giant grating had been revealed. My host tossed something through the air at me, underhand. It hit the floor and skittered in my direction. It was a flashlight, a big, heavy-duty thing as long as my forearm. I stepped to my left and picked it up and switched it on. When I looked up again, the guy had left the doorway and was gone. I walked up to the grating and I shone the light into it. The grid looked metallic and created dozens of holes about 3 feet wide each. The beam from the flashlight reached down into the holes, but it died before it hit anything. I leaned over and coughed just to hear the echo. I could tell by it that the pit was very, very deep. Just blackness down there. It was cold down there, too. A draft came up. I looked and listened. I didn't know what I was supposed to be seeing or hearing, but I was fascinated by then, and I waited. Eventually, I heard something moving, shifting. I kept moving the flashlight, trying to spot it down there. The beam caught something. Some colorless mass, about 15 or 20 feet down. At first, I swear I thought it was a giant balloon that was floating from left to right. That's what I thought because it was so quiet. But the beam caught more context, more depth, just enough to form a different shape. I think I told you already I didn't know anything about the region, the myths. Never read anything. Why should I have? I grew up in Akron, for God's sake. What passed from left to right down there, out of the shadows and back into them again so quickly, was the top of a human head and the bare neck and bare shoulders that supported it. A bald human head, but of a size so gigantic that after it had stopped moving and found another space out of the reach of my flashlight beam, I took a bunch of involuntary steps back from the grating and calculated, trying to bring some kind of mathematical logic to it. But I understood why the grating was so big, why the pit below had to be constructed specially. The prisoner had made no sound beyond the shifting of its limbs down there. Everything was silent again for a minute, but then there was a staticky pop, and I heard my host's voice coming through a PA speaker somewhere nearby. It was tough to make out the words sometimes because of the little dropouts, the gaps. He was saying he thought it was finally time to open the other door now. It made sense to do it. There was no point in keeping it shut anymore. Then a second click and pop, and he was gone again. I approached the grating for another look, but the prisoner didn't appear again, didn't respond to the probing of the flashlight. I pointed the beam around the cold room around me, and I only saw a blocky object in one far corner, silvery looking. If I'd been listening more carefully when I came in, I might have heard it humming, a refrigerator. My first thought was feeding. My host must have pressed another button somewhere because I could hear another clumsy mechanism working in the distance, grinding like it was in some faraway part of the house or down below me. When it stopped, a clock in the other room chimed 5 times. Listening to that helped me breathe, actually, helped me settle my nerves. I kept hold of the flashlight and turned and left that chamber before I could hear anything else that might scare me. In the other room, I looked at the bodies, how they had settled in death. They must have all laid down beforehand on the carpet. I spotted a couple of paper cups nearby. One of the women had covered the left side of her face with her hand like she was shy, or maybe didn't want to see what was going on around her as she faded. I went to the other side of the mansion, toward the front entrance, down another hall, past a kitchen, past a room of marble with a fireplace as big as any I had ever seen. I went to the front door, and I opened it. This side of the house bordered woods and fields, too. There was no main road leading here. The place was totally isolated. The sky outside was still partially dark and gray. A very light rain had begun to fall, not more than a mist. Something was out there, a tiny visual anomaly, out beyond the overgrown grounds and beyond a long, gentle slope toward what looked like an orchard. Beyond that, the hills started, and the dense forest, the kind of terrain that would probably swallow me up with no chance of finding my way. And in the distance, those tall mountains that were nothing but ominous black cutouts. I had a lot of courage back then, much more than I do now, 30 years later. I walked toward the orchard. There, my host was slumped down in the wet grass with his back against a tree. He was dead. His mouth was hanging stupidly open. His eyes were half shut. He was clutching a paper cup. I kneeled in front of him. His whole neck was blue. He must have pressed that button and, right away, with no hesitation, walked out to his death spot. Maybe he knew I'd come this way. The mansion was small now, in the distance behind me. I could go back there, around it, and walk back the way I'd come from, but looking at those mountains in the distance, I believed that the prisoner wanted them instead. That was where I should go if I wanted to see, and now I desperately did. I went toward the forest. I wouldn't have gone far, I can tell you. I would have stopped when they got too dense, maybe only a few hundred yards. I had no desire to stumble around blindly in this foreign land, unprotected. I had a perimeter of safety very much in mind. I had just reached its edge when my perception of reality changed forever. The sky was now a solid gray, maybe only another 10 minutes before true dawn. The rain was so soft, I remember, this fine, silent spray that barely even soaked my clothes. I never felt a rain quite like that before. No wind. The trees were getting thick around me, and I heard scampering things in the brush. I was facing east, and then I turned to the north to start following a thin, lazy stream, and I heard something big moving near me, up ahead to my right. The trees in that direction were being jostled ever so slightly. The prisoner appeared in a wide gap between the trees. We'd been traveling almost parallel to each other. I will make my final guess about its height, since I can't trust my memories to ever be more concrete than they are now. Its head was maybe a few yards above the trees behind it, so I will say 50 feet tall. Its naked body proportionate. The body had no color. None. It wasn't muscled like a regular body. The limbs were doughy and without much definition. But it was recognizably a creature like you or me. It moved uncertainly with careful calculation. I craned my neck and saw it take 3 huge steps toward the east and then stop. The prisoner began to turn. Its head swiveled like it was totally unjoined from its body, where you or I would partially twist our torsos at some sound or scent behind us. It was only its head that turned, like on a rusty hinge. The prisoner had no corneas in its eyes. I didn't even know that word back then. I had to look it up later. They were just white all the way through. The defining ridges above them were almost non-existent, like someone had just pushed 2 white marbles into a malformed lump of dough and said, "I call you man." It saw me. I felt it. It was almost an out-of-body experience, the fear I felt, like my spirit was leaving me behind to die. I started to turn to escape, and then there was a split-second blip of movement in the sky, some dark mass flitting into my sightline from the right. There was a thumping sound that was delayed by the distance for maybe a quarter of a second, and then a small explosion of dust or ash erupted from the prisoner's neck and left shoulder. Dust or ash, not blood. It had been struck by a passing flock of birds. The prisoner's jaw dropped, and it shrieked, a high-pitched and almost musical cry, completely unlike anything I would have believed a body like that would have inside of it. Its entire head tilted suddenly to the left, like some vital structure inside its neck had been snapped, and it settled at a hideous angle. The small section of the body that had sustained the blow was just gone. The debris that had been loosened was sifting down to the ground in a cloud, dissipating. And the prisoner began to fall. Then I was running. 2 times. 2 times. I slipped and slammed into the ground just like the panicky victim in some horror movie. It was the slickness of the terrain beneath my feet that got me the first time, and my sheer momentum the second time. I ran back through the orchard past my host's corpse, and very soon I got back into the mansion. I emerged into the front room and found myself among all the bodies again, my shirt and my pants soaked and muddy. I had decisions to make. I took the coward's way out. I made no phone call to the authorities. I collected myself and ran through my mind the route back to the train station as best I could, given my unhinged state of mind. I had to go over it again and again, my hands clutched to the side of my head. I was so scared I couldn't make simple connections. For 10 minutes, I was among the dead bodies. Then I went out the back door, where I saw, for the first time, the details of the other 5 or 6 corpses I'd been spared the night before, including one body in a wheelchair on the patio. I had no idea how I hadn't seen him the night before, but then again, maybe he'd been around somewhere, still alive, listening to my host and I speak, maybe, before deciding, like the others, that Dr. Penny's idea was one that should be followed. My wobbly legs took me far away. I never truly felt safe until the train hut appeared, a sign of humanity. I couldn't go in there, not in my state. Whenever they eventually found the scene at the mansion, I'd be too memorable an image. That is, if the police in Varna hadn't already forwarded my picture around. I never did go back inside that train station. Getting out of the country took 2 weeks, and I had to cover a lot of ground on foot. No, I never saw another thing like the prisoner in my desperate time crossing that terrain. I heard wolves and even saw them. I went hungry and sleepless, scared of so many sounds. I stuck close to villages and small towns and never rested my head at night unless I could see lights through the trees. On my last day in that country, I dared enter a library in a village called Bombrostu. I read things there about mountain myths and legends and impossible things no one believed in anymore. There was a newspaper in the library, too. Dr. Penny and his friends had only been discovered after 5 days of lying in and around that mansion. No mention of anything found in the surrounding woods. And who would know to look for the signs of something enormous having been dragged away by something of similar size? I read about one more thing there in the library, about birds, and how unlikely it was that a whole flock of them could miscalculate and crash into an almost stationary object, maybe killing them all. And to this day, I think they were attacking instead. Within a month, I'd managed to get to Warsaw. Then someone got me on a boat all the way into Dundee. Inside of 3 months, I was back in America. I've never committed another crime. I'm 52 now. I live in Jersey City. Here, the closest things to real mountains are giant towers of steel and glass and construction cranes that make these rusty, high-pitched, almost musical sounds when they bend just so in the distance.